Camping is one of my favorite things to do in the spring and summer, and luckily enough it is just in the middle of summer for us all to enjoy a nice camping trip. Or so we thought. These people sent in some truly scary camping stories that they claim are true, but at the end of the day, that is up to you to believe if they are or not. If you have a story you would like to share on a future video, be sure to do so by submitting it at swampdweller.net or the email you can find in the description down below. I would love to share your story with everyone here in the swamp. It's stories like yours that keep this channel going. Now, let's get into these creepy camping experiences. Hello, much love from RSA. South Africa is such a mystical place, so here's one tale of many. When I was 12 and in grade 6, I went to a camp for a school tour. Everything seemed normal if you're used to chilling in Victorian-era buildings. We all got split into groups of 4, so we would go to different dorms. I was with the bulk of the boys the first night and went and chilled as normal. However, everything started around 2 a.m. that night. As boys typically do, we sat trying to figure out a way to sneak out and head for the girls' dorm. After we managed to get past the first counselor, we started sneaking through the shadows. That's when Carl and Tevin stopped suddenly. I asked them what was wrong, and they said they could hear whispers coming from the veld behind the trees. Trying to be brave and encouraged by the power of boners, we continued pushing forward. After what seemed like hours but was probably only 2 minutes, we were outside the girls' dorm, and there was only like one light on. There was no noise, but we still decided to go look to see if somebody was still up to be safe. Just before we got to the door, we saw something. It was the shadow of a man, but it had the head of a buck. It was huge and properly massive. We all froze, and bravery went out the window. It wasn't my proudest moment, but I ran. Every single one of us ran. Every cell in my being told me to bail, and I did. Once I ran, so did the others. We got back in 30 seconds flat as we got into the door, terrified out of our minds. We heard screams and I went straight to bed. I figured if I'm going to die, I was going to do so happy. The second night is when my beliefs were fully shaken. The whole day the girls were quiet. A few actually got their parents to fetch them. The day went as smooth as it possibly could go. Nobody wanted to head into the bushes. Then came the night. Nobody dared to go out. A few even peed in bottles. Screw using the bathroom outside, we thought. At about 1 a.m., a few of us managed to fall asleep, but unfortunately, I wasn't one of them. The area around us went dead quiet. The dogs even stopped barking. It was like the world hit mute. Then, one noise broke the silence. The door slid open. I slowly looked up, hoping it would be a counselor, but it was that thing in our dorm. It just stood there. I couldn't even see its eyes. It was just a buckhead. It was darker than the shadows in the night. That's how we spotted it in the dark. I was staring at it, too scared to look away, tears running down my eyes when I heard the only noise apart from my heart pounding. The sound of the guy next to me, crying in this anticlimactic way. The sounds of whatever this creature was, walking away, started to emanate. It was walking towards us, I think. I blacked out from fear. When I awoke in the morning, the next guy next to me was gone. They said he left during the night, but we all left that day. The tour ended a week early. I only saw him again a week later, and he left school. I do not know what I saw, but I will never, ever forget it. This happened about 13 years ago. I was in Boy Scouts, and the whole way there, my friend and I, who I'll call Ricky for privacy reasons, had our Nintendo DS out playing Pokemon, when one of the adults who were driving us up to the Table Rock in South Carolina told us about the trail that Native Americans used to consider dangerous. It was about 45 minutes into the ride, and I start reading about the dangerous trail on my phone. 3 people disappeared from there, and 1 person barely escaped. I thought it just happened to be a coincidence, but boy, was I wrong. We get to our campsite at around 9 p.m. I set my tent right by the woods, in detail with some more people because of curiosity about what happened. Later that night, we started hearing twigs and sticks break from the woods. I grab my pocket knife and go get another scout who we'll call Dwayne from his tent. He was an Eagle Scout and was about 6 foot tall. I was about 5'11", so we weren't too far off. When we went near the woods, we saw something human-like, but with pale skin. It made this loud screaming sound. That's when we booked it to the Scoutmasters. We just laid there and were really upset and had to be brought home at 2 a.m. because of the anxiety. Whatever that thing was, looked hungry or mad. If anyone knows what it could have been, please tell me. And I do apologize for how short this was, but thank you for sharing it anyway, if you do. This would be around 4 years ago now. We had found our favorite camping spot that summer. A 3.5-mile hike to a lean-to built along a scenic lake, part of a larger 20-mile loop. The trail leads past a splattering of small glacial lakes, with maybe half a dozen lean-tos built in the early 60s. Lean-tos being a public shelter, there are rules that apply. One is that you have to share it with people, even if you don't want to. Usually up to a maximum of 8 or so people. The area offered primitive camping as well, but the terrain wasn't ideal. It was usually very swampy around the lakes and too hilly or dense in other parts. So, this first lean-to became our spot. The first few times I went that summer, nobody happened to be there. We lucked out, it seems, because the following story is one of multiple people we met on that trip. Mostly though, it's about the woman who firmly believed that it must be a Sasquatch. This particular trip I took was in late August, a busy time for hiking in the southern Adirondacks. The typically treacherous dirt road leading to the trail road had finally been covered in gravel, making the drive a breeze. When we arrived, there were more cars than normal, so we knew that someone may have already gotten to the lean-to first. Even though the rule is to share it, people usually keep going and don't even ask if you're already there. I'm sure the idea of sleeping next to a stranger doesn't sit well with most. Others just may like privacy or feeling awkward asking. Not disheartened, we set off at a fast pace to try to beat everyone else that may have been on the trail ahead of us. Before we even got a half an hour into the hike, we ran into our first character of the trip. Now I hope I can capture this correctly, because we talked about this guy for the rest of the 2 days we were out there. He really didn't sit right with us, and honestly it kind of colored the rest of the trip. He was a middle-aged, nondescript white man with a full-body hiking pack and a walking stick. There really isn't much about him physically that I can remember except that he wasn't dressed completely in sporty hiking gear. He was kind of dressed odd, if I can say so myself. As if every piece of the garment he had was from a store like EMS, and he'd worn it only once. Secondly, he looked like a runner. Something in his posture and lean legs suggested it. As we approached him, he nods as if he's going to pass and then says, "You guys just came from the lot?" Now, that is a weird question, to begin with, because the path we were on didn't lead you to the parking lot. But we nodded yes. "How many cars are in the parking lot?" he then asked. We didn't think twice about the question at the time, and one of us told him like 7 or 8. We asked him if there was anyone at first at the lean-to, and he said that he had seen some smoke coming from that direction and thought that he heard some people there. He then asked us if we looked at the sign in the book. We could have seen if anyone was going there for the night and if they had already signed in. We said no, we hadn't and didn't even know there was a sign-in book. His eyes got real wide. "Oh, you two didn't sign in? You really should sign in so people know that you were here. If you get disappeared or get hurt, they'll know where you were." He then goes on about the sign in the book, really driving that point home, that we should have signed in and how important it is. After this short rant, he goes on to ask us again, how many cars are in the parking lot? This time it caused my friend to pause with a funny look on his face. I don't know, we said like 8 or something. As I sit here and write, I actually cannot remember why I did this, but after my friend answered him the second time, I asked him, "Did you sign in?" To which he barked a short, mean-sounding laugh and looked at me sideways. Ha! Nah, I never sign in. Not much stands out about our parting, but that thing just freaked me out for the rest of the time thinking about his words. I kind of hurried away from this guy with an uneasy feeling. The questions he had asked stood out as very odd, and I started to wonder what the man's purpose was in even being out here. Why was he so concerned with how many cars were in the parking lot? What was up with that sign-in thing? And how he seemed to know where everyone on the trail was? The rest of the hike to the lean-to was filled with talk about him and how we hoped the lean-to would be empty. Sure enough, as we rounded the final bend to the lakeside, we could smell the smell of a campfire, and we knew he had been right. As we near the lean-to, I call out so they know that we are there and we don't startle them. Hunched over the fire is a man maybe in his mid-30s, and in the lean-to is a woman of about the same age. They had their equipment spread across the inside of the lean-to, making it quite clear they were set up for the night. There's not a tremendous amount of specifics I remember about our arrival. My friends and I introduced ourselves, and asked if we could stay for a minute while we ate and decided what we wanted to do. They seemed very welcoming, and said by all means hang out for a bit. We ate, talked about possibly hiking back out and going home or continuing to the next lean-to. The issue with the second option was that we had left a bit late in the day, and the next lean-to was another 3.5 miles at least. This would put us hiking there partly in the dark, and we would have no time to collect our firewood. This was before I came back in future years and discovered a good primitive spot nearby the same lean-to that would serve as a backup if it was ever occupied. As it started to get dark and some rain clouds started to roll over the mountains, they kindly offered to share the lean-to with us. Pretty soon, they were getting ready to eat dinner themselves and needed to gather some more firewood. We offered to help, and it was kind of a really cool moment, us with these strangers working together to perform such a wholesome and natural task. As we worked, we small-talked and got to know each other a bit more. One thing immediately noted during this time, though, was how guarded they both seemed. Both of them seemed really uneasy around us, though the talk was light and casual. Maybe they figured us being two young guys coming out of the spot in the middle of the woods we were up to no good, but that could be further from the truth. Whatever it was, it drove the woman to turn to us at one point and say, "Just so you two know, I have a handgun on me." Right away, I took it as she was being responsible and didn't want us to get freaked out if we saw it. So I said lightly that I was into guns too and asked if I could check it out. She took it out and showed it to me. Honestly, I don't even remember what it was. What I do remember is that she then went on to eat dinner and didn't put it away, just rested it on her lap as she ate. Thinking that was a bit odd, I assumed that she would put it away at some point. After their dinner, the boyfriend asked if we wanted a drink. They brought out a bottle of whiskey. I'm excited because maybe they can finally loosen up a bit. Maybe we could relax and have a good night instead of this weird tension. A few drinks in, I realize that the girlfriend still has the handgun out. Not only that, but she's holding it as she remembers it's a gun. Not only that, but she's holding it as if she doesn't even remember it's a gun. As we talk, she's gesturing with her hands, waving it about. When she isn't animated, she just holds it loosely, letting it dangle between her legs as she drinks with her other hand. Over time, I start paying attention to her and the gun more than anything else, trying to make out whether she has her finger on the trigger. Dropping small social hints that we were uncomfortable. Looking back, I do ask myself why we stayed, and why we didn't just say, "Hey, you don't have to have that gun out the whole night." I guess maybe I sensed that she was a bit erratic and didn't want to upset her. I also kept doubting that it was on purpose and maybe she was just really irresponsible. Because other than that, everything else felt normal. Either way, both my friend and I quietly got more worried as she swung her pistol all over the campground. Half a bottle of whiskey later, I could feel myself getting tired. The talk had largely faded out and the four of us had resigned to silently staring at the fire and occasionally asking for the bottle. Suddenly, there was a tremendous splash in the lake right next to us, It sounded like somebody had jumped in. It was so loud. It startled all four of us, and we sat up instantly. We were listening intently. Another splash followed, but the complete opposite side of us. Same sound, a huge crash as if somebody had jumped in. We quickly started speculating what it could be. Frogs were my guess. There are large bullfrogs out there that will jump into the lake and sound like a freaking boulder while doing so. "It was Sasquatch," the lady blurts out. We laugh and say, yeah, sure, but she insists. Sasquatches roam the area, she says. Their favorite thing to do is throw rocks in the lakes to scare people. My friend and I laugh again, still expecting her to laugh with us, but she stays stone-faced and goes into a full rant on the local Sasquatch. The talk dies down after a few minutes and we all fall silent once more. A third splash goes off, this time around the original spot. We all look around at each other, and after a moment she says, "I'm gonna let off a few shots to scare it." And before anyone could respond, she quickly proceeded to empty her entire magazine into the darkness. I was sitting next to her and far enough forward that I could feel the change of the air pressure from the pistol shots. We slept with them that night in the lean-to. Even when she laid down, she had the pistol, had it right next to her left hand. I was laying at her feet. I kept thinking to myself as I drifted off that she could wake up in the middle of the night and shoot us both in the head, and that would be that. I still went to sleep though, waking up to them packing up their stuff and heading out early. Had a good sleep too. It was a pretty creepy time. Thanks for sharing my story. About 2 years ago, my husband and I took our 5 kids to a water theme park in Idaho. We live in Washington State. I can't remember the name for the life of me right now. We borrowed my dad's trailer and truck and thought it would be less expensive and more fun if we camped at a campground down the road than the one made for the park. I have driven through Idaho before, and so has my husband, but we've never stayed there before. To preface my experience, I have had nightmares on occasion where I felt like something was trying to possess me, and I always end up reciting the Lord's Prayer or yelling Jesus is my savior. I'll be honest, it takes a couple of tries and I always have my husband wake up because I am screaming. I regularly pray for protection, wear protective crystals, and ask my guardians for protection. I feel as though because I regularly research and read into the paranormal, it's best to take precautions. So, here we are at this campground. The first night, everything was great. Nothing happened. The next day, we take the kids to the park, spend all day there, and come back to cook dinner and get ready for bed. I also must say, while I have read a lot about sleep paralysis, I have never experienced it until this night, and have not since. Once we were all in bed, I start to fall asleep. While asleep, I feel awake. I can see the trailer around me in kind of what feels like a blur, but I am unable to shout, scream, or even move. I look to the end of my bed and see what looks like a short 4-foot or so demon-like thing. In my head, it feels like it's a native of some kind, but it has horns and it is difficult to make out its face, and it's just terrifying. All of a sudden, I feel my husband grab my arm and I'm awake. He says, "You were screaming, are you okay?" I told him I was fine and tried to go back to sleep, but the same thing happened again, except this time, the demon was closer to me. I remember in my head shouting, "Jesus is my savior, go away," but he wouldn't. I remember trying to scream for my husband, but I couldn't. Then once again, my husband grabs my arm and wakes me up saying I'm still screaming. At this point, I still told him I was fine. I attempted to sleep once more, and the same thing happened again and again. The demon thing was getting closer every time I went to sleep. No matter what I tried, he wouldn't leave, and again my husband would wake me up. This time I told him what was going on. He said he was sorry. This time, I didn't try to fall back asleep. I wrapped up as much of him around me as I could, and desperately tried not to sleep. I felt like something was trying to pull me to sleep, but I fought it. Next thing I know, I woke up the next morning and told my husband the entire story. I have never researched the area, and I can't remember the name of the campground. Because I was so terrified, I haven't really shared this story until recently. Thank you, Swamp Dweller, for giving me an area to do so. Labor Day of 2015. My mother, my wife, and 3 children, and I went to a very remote cabin that we rented out. It was an old fire watchman station or something of the sort, so it had the cabin and 3 other sheds and shops. I'll try to keep it short now, but this is a bizarre story. We unpacked, settled into the cabin, and then decided to walk a couple of 100 yards down to the river, barefoot in sandals with shorts for all of us. We got down to the pebbled shore, and were playing and throwing rocks. Suddenly I realized there were about 1-foot snakes everywhere. My wife, mom, and I yanked up the 3 kids and boogied off. After reaching a safe distance from them, I went back with a water bottle and caught one of them to see what it was. Turns out, they were in a nest of diamondback rattlesnakes. If one of those things had latched onto one of my kids, they would have died. We were about 3 hours away from any medical facility. We got back to the cabin and my mom and I went for a hike and walk alone while my wife calmed the kiddos down and fed them lunch. Upon returning about 15 minutes later, all 3 of my kids and wife were inside with the doors and windows all closed up, even though we had everything open to cool off the place. We went inside to hear all 4 of them start yelling about a bear that was about 150 yards away from the cabin, huffing and puffing at my wife and kids on the front porch, eating. It was down by the river, another 30 yards or so down the hill. He poked his head up. A few hours go by, and in that time, an ATV passed by 3 times, with 2 inbred-looking freaks on it. And each time they stopped in the front of the gate onto the property and stared at us in our cabin. Keep in mind, we're 2 hours into the wilderness in Idaho, with no sight of a person the whole entire trip, except them. We decided it's bedtime for the kiddos, as it's pitch black out. Within 10 minutes, our son, who was 5 at the time, went from being perfectly fine, active, and talkative to having a fever of 103, slightly foaming at the mouth, and being completely unresponsive. That was it. We were leaving immediately and going to seek medical attention. I opened the front door and start loading everything into the 2 cars, by the light of the front porch bulb in the headlights of the cars, which are both parked facing the gate. That's when all 3 adults heard about 4 to 6 large and heavy animals running all around the cabin and property. There was one right next to the side of the house when exiting that I could hear pacing back and forth, breathing heavily. I made everyone stay inside and close the door. Every time I went outside to transfer stuff to the cars, about 4 or 5 trips, I had a stick and a big pot that I was smacking as hard and loud as I could each trip, and was yelling loudly at random. As soon as I'm all done with the loading, I take each kid out individually and load them up between the 2 cars, then escort my mom out, then my wife out. My wife and I are in the lead car, so we pull out ahead of the gate, and for some stupid reason or another, I felt that I needed to close the gate. So I got out of my vehicle and walked behind it, and my mom's car about 15 feet, and closed the gate. Now this gate was literally a log that slides from one post to the other. It offered 0 protection or barrier between me and the animals out there. Right as I went to turn around, I heard loud, padded footsteps walking up to me. Directly in front of me, no more than 10 feet, icy eyes shimmering from the moonlight as the deepest, scariest growl I have ever heard in my life emanated. I turned and ran so fast that I swear I must have jumped from where I was into the driver's seat of my car, some 30 feet behind me. As I landed in my seat, I slammed it into drive and spun out, finally leaving, but it gets weirder and scarier. About 15 minutes down the road, we were still panicking about our unresponsive son, and we both kept having this horrible, evil feeling like the shadow was over us or something. I looked down and realized I still had that baby rattlesnake in the water bottle, in the cup holder, so I grabbed it and threw it out the window immediately. Not even 2 minutes later, we hear our son softly crying. We realize he's responsive, and he stated something along the lines of, "Why are we leaving? What's going on?" He was crying because he was sad to leave. He couldn't remember the last hour or so. Quick backstory for what's next. My mother was about 58 years old at the time. She had been a Jehovah's Witness my whole life, plus many more years beforehand. and she is the last person in the entire world to believe in signs, evil spirits, omens, etc. The next day, my mom broke down extremely sad, sobbing her eyes out, hardly able to talk. She confessed to my wife that the night before we left, she had a nightmare in which we went on the camping trip. We came across snakes, a bear, and a pack of wolves. She said she knew a lot of bad things happened at that outpost, and it was full of evil. Most of all, she said, one of your kids died. I swear on my life, to this very day, if I ask her who died and how it happened, she immediately starts crying and refuses to tell me or anyone. She lives her life now with guilt that she was willingly ignoring that nightmare and put us in a situation, nearly taking one of her dear grandkids away from this world. She doesn't deserve to feel like that. I know this sounds all crazy, but a week later, on the local news, there were reports of a wolf pack in that area. Wolves and bears do not coexist in harmony, but, as far as I know, they do share territories and do respect each other from time to time. This outpost station of sorts was about 1.5 hours into the wilderness from Lowman Banks, Idaho, if you want to verify the animals actually exist around there. Sadly, I grew up in the mountains for most of my pre- and early teen years, as did my wife until she was 10 years old. I even have a sleeve of wilderness trees on my left arm. With that said, we don't care to go into the mountains anymore, and we definitely don't camp. Thanks for listening to these scary camping stories. If you enjoyed them, please hit that like button as it helps me out a ton. If you're new to the swamp, hit subscribe and turn on notifications to never miss a new video, as I upload them almost every single day, and all things natural and supernatural. If you have a story you would like to share in a future video, be sure to submit it at swampdweller.net or the email you can find in the description down below. I'll see you guys soon with another creepy video.